Okay, hi everybody. December 31st, 2018. I'm doing a little high-tech 3-camera setup here because I'm trying to make my YouTube, which will be from a different angle this time, and my audio, and then this live. Monday's a great day to go live. I don't know what time of day I'm going to set this, but today's a holiday, so I'm doing it right now at 10:30 Pacific time. Maybe I'll move it to the afternoon in the future, but Mondays I'll go live. The rest of the days of the week I will do YouTubes and continue to post audios. And I took this weekend off, which was great. I just played around in the real world. Well, one day I spent in a virtual reality immersive environment, and that was a whole experience and commentary on where we are as human beings right now, where the state of creativity is going, and where artists can get dollars for what they do. Basically, is what that was a comment on for me. And then yesterday I was at the zoo where I did just a lot of enjoying of beholding and my own drawing for myself. So I'm going to get into the topic of drawing and how art has played a role in my life so far later. But today, this is Everyday Truth with Dr. Lisa Chu. And yeah, today I wanted to talk about this like evolution that's happening in my mind and my consciousness right now, that's like warp speed and pretty amazing. And I'll just dive right in with my example, because I think I do better when I start with a story of my actual experience. So I became aware of a woman named Pamela Weibel. I'm gonna like position myself so you can see my free as a bird t-shirt. Dr. Pamela Weibel, family physician in Eugene, Oregon, who started making herself more vocal on social media like 6 years ago, maybe. And I actually spoke to her on the phone. I think I reached out to her by email at that time, and she was answering every single email herself with a phone call. And I think she still does that. She's amazingly high touch with her interactions. At that time, she had come out with a book called Pet Goats and Pap Smears, and it had a really bold cover where there was somebody in the stirrups in her room, and then like a goat standing between their legs, and it was her collection of stories from being a family physician and creating a practice model where she was practicing medicine the way she'd always dreamed of and known that she was born to do, which was high touch, high interaction, and actually taking care of people, which is surprisingly not what is emphasized in medical school. So she came out with that. Her website at that time, it still is, it's idealmedicalcare.org, and her message was really around trying to encourage people to live their dream. And it was sort of the same language that I was using as a life coach at the time, trying to be like inspirational and talk about the possibilities, which is really important, half of the equation. But I was totally bought into like, don't say anything disturbing, negative, or potentially controversial. Just inspire people with glitter and sparkles and unicorns. And she literally she wears like glitter makeup and big, naturally curly red hair. I mean, she's amazing. I mean, so her very first images of herself on social media were glittery goddess woman, and she just owned that. And if you know anything about the medical space and how the oppression is live and well there, people, you will know how risky that was. If she were looking to be accepted by mainstream medicine and build any sort of a professional reputation as a doctor in the medical community, mainstream, like she was breaking all of the rules. about professionalism, propriety, and like basically looking and acting like an unemotional robot on the outside while maintaining a great bedside manner and being extremely scientific in thinking. That's only a recent development in medicine, by the way. And it's something that so many of us have accepted as real medicine, that her book was really about reminding people and herself that medicine and healing are about connecting with humans and the messiness of being human. And so the cover of that book is just so great in showing us that it's like such a lie that we've been believing about how things should be done in our health and healing. So fast forward, I mean, she was very, very generous with me in terms of just saying, like, call me anytime, let's do, and I was still sort of finding my foothold in this whole healing world. And she evolved into, so her language, she was just like very, very systematic about her blogging and putting herself out there on social media. And her message evolved into a concern about physician suicide. And then as she looked into the word burnout, she really rebelled against the use of the word burnout and started to use language around human rights violations and abuse within the medical system. And that's about the time that I was moving from doing healing body work into my own art practice. So I was going totally full on into the bliss realm and into the from the body work, which is like relax, go to a relaxation physiology, like tune it all out, Om, into like let me make pretty pictures that make people feel good. Back to kind of that early inspirational mindset. And then she was going into exposing now what I now know as the truth, but what I perceived for about 4 years as like totally unnecessary inflammatory information. So I'm just observing that reaction and noting that there's times in our lives when we cannot accept the truth. If we are the ones who are on the receiving end of oppression and abuse, we can't hear that language sometimes, maybe for years, decades of our life, because it would require us to face our own fear of freedom. Let me finish the Pamela Wible before I talk about Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed. Okay, so for 4 years I couldn't read any of Pamela Wible's posts because I'm like, why is she calling the medical system abusive? Why is she using this language? Why is she exposing the insider aspects of the medical culture that are totally accepted? Now, I'm talking about 4 to 5 years ago. She was talking about blatant abuse of medical students. And like, let me just tell you that at the time I was going through medical school, and now it's changing a little bit, I think. I don't know. I haven't been in a medical school for 19 years. So, but at the time it was totally accepted that medical students, it was a hazing process where you get abused as part of your initiation into the field, the hallowed halls of medicine. So you sign up, you pay $200,000 for 4 years if you're going, I went to a public university medical school, but it was out of state. So yeah, it was $200,000. And you sign up for the privilege of reading a bunch of textbooks, taking a bunch of multiple choice tests, being in the presence of great physicians. This is the way that it was taught in my medical school. There are a few that are more interactive, but and then rotating through the hospital and being a doctor, like a training, a doctor in training. And in that process, there's like a whole hierarchy of physicians who were trained over the last century who were abused themselves as part of that process. So it's their duty to pass it on to their students to make sure that that tradition is intact, especially in surgery. So what you're doing as a student in surgery is you get the privilege of scrubbing in. And I remember my first day on surgery, it was cancer. It was oncology surgery. We were doing a lymph node dissection. So you're really nervous scrubbing because you don't even know what you're doing. Like, am I ruining things? Like, it's a little bit daunting the very first time you scrub in because you don't know what you're supposed to touch and what you're not supposed to touch. So part of my initiation was like the attending surgeon took one look at me and he's like, "She's not sterile. Do it again." It was great. So I was, of course, I was trained for this. This is like my life prepared me to be the perfect student. I'm like, okay, like I did it wrong. Take it all off. Let me do it again. And I would do anything to make that guy happy, including the privilege of standing there. So it was a axial lymph node dissection underarm, holding the retractor, like standing behind the shoulder of the patient, not being able to see what's going on in the field of view, but like holding the retractor and pulling back on the deltoid muscle for like 6 hours while everyone else watched the surgery happening. So hazing, I know, is a hallowed tradition in so many different systems of authoritarian control of people. So you have to like break people down to the point where they have zero sense of self and they start to obey whatever authority is there. I mean, this is what they do to prisoners when they want to break them down psychologically so that they will comply. And it's really about compliance. And this is the culture within a lot of workplaces. It's the assumption, but I'm just going to talk about medicine now since that's what I know. And we're talking about Pamela Weibel and how she's changed her language from trying to inspire people, just directly inspire people to start their own practices, and to say no to assembly line medicine and factory worker-like conditions, and to name their own way of practicing and actually start that practice in the real world. So the evolution is that she's gone from that idealized language to talking about abuse and suicide and the unconscionable things that people have to endure in order to be initiated into the medical system. And she's using that as a way to ignite people's real emotions to get them to take the steps to create that idealized environment. And so that's the link. That's why inspiration is only half of it. And like all of the bubbles and unicorns are half of the story. The other half is waking up from denial. Because in order to have accepted and complied with abuse at all levels, some part of you, or perhaps all of you, has had to go into denial. So this book was published back in 1979. It's Paulo Freire was a Brazilian philosopher, educator actually. He was working with peasants in the Brazilian countryside, educating them, for which he was imprisoned immediately by the authoritarian military dictatorship in Brazil at the time. So yeah, when you're a military dictatorship trying to control the people and maintain your own power, education of the lowest level of society is extremely dangerous for that regime to stay in power. So what do you have to do with those people? Put them away. But he wrote a book which is being interpreted in a lot of different ways now. I think it's really the basis for a lot of the social justice movement now in America. And so we're trying to kind of find language for liberation of the oppressed, whatever that means. In every society there's an oppressed class. But I'm going to just read a excerpt. It's a book that takes a while to take in because so many of the things we take for granted, like the slow waking up process, facing the truth of oppressive and abusive educational environments and training environments that professional people in our society go through, is it's a slow process, but she's doing it. Pamela Weibel's rocking it. Long story short, last night I saw something from her feed again, and it really hit me in a different way. And I started to look through all of her posts, and I realized what she's doing. And that's why I'm able to talk about it today. For 4 years, I was like, the woman is crazy. I don't know what she's talking about. I don't know why she's using the word abuse, referring to medical education. I don't know why she's exposing the secrets of this great institution of medical training that we have. And now I get it. I really get it that she's speaking to the people who are ready to free themselves and not take the bullshit anymore. So here's a little quote from Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which refers to what happens when you educate the people who are oppressed about the fact that they are oppressed, instead of expecting the oppressors to lead the oppressed into their own freedom. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So on this, he says, the fear of freedom which afflicts the oppressed, a fear which may equally well lead them to desire the role of oppressor or bind them to the role of oppressed, should be examined. One of the basic elements of the relationship between oppressor and oppressed is prescription. Interesting that that's the word we use for what doctors give to their patients. Every prescription represents the imposition of one individual's choice upon another, transforming the consciousness of the person prescribed into one that conforms with the prescriber's consciousness. The oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. Freedom would require them to eject this image and replace it with autonomy and responsibility. Freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift. It must be pursued constantly and responsibly. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of man, nor is it an idea which becomes myth. It is rather the indispensable condition for the quest for human completion. So we're in this extremely transformative time right now on our planet where the human consciousness is entering its next surge in its quest for completion, which of course there's no finality in completion. It's this constant quest that we pursue. But so the first thing that he says is when we're oppressed unconsciously, we don't see ourselves as that. So we want to stay in that position of being oppressed or taking the power that we see the oppressor having over us. So this explains why when people are, as an example in the medical tradition of a tradition of hazing and abuse as like initiation, if that happened to you as a young student, you better believe that when you're a professor, you're going to give it back as retribution or as, hey, that's how I became great. So I'm going to give this gift to you because that's how I am. And I have to believe that actually as that person who took the abuse and then became this person in a position of power. I have to believe that that served me because that's my ego construct. Because if I were actually to wake up to that and rebel, where would that leave me? I've risen to a position of power within the very system that took advantage of my powerlessness, basically. So there are people who are not perpetuating that. But basically, because of how the medical industrial system has evolved through corporate interests, you have to play that game of acquiring power in a corporate structure. So how do you do that? It's certainly not by becoming a more humane and caring physician. Because guess what? The MBAs don't have a place to plug that in their spreadsheets. It doesn't have an accounting term that can go onto the publicly traded company's P&L on the quarterly earnings call. There's no place for caring there. If there's no measurement for it in the eyes of a bean counter, it doesn't exist. So that's an easy way. And the more bean counters we have in systems like medicine, the more that the infrastructures can grow. If you notice, I don't know if in your town this is the case, but how many new hospital buildings are being constructed in your metropolitan area in the United States right now? Parking structures, buildings, beautiful 2-story glass lobbies with expensive contemporary art. There's a lot of money going into the healthcare system that has nothing to do with health and nothing to do with care. So I'm going to try to not get too far away from the personal here, but I wanted to just sort of put some images into your head about how the mechanization and dehumanization that starts as a seed somewhere spreads out and touches every single one of us. So the work of waking up people to the truth, whether it starts with you as a patient, and everything that I've said in that was said in that quote from Paulo Freire about the oppressed, that I was applying to the medical student, can be applied to the patient. We have, as patients in the U.S., been completely brainwashed into believing that doctors, or this nebulous idea of the healthcare system, which, by the way, we've designed our entire lives around getting healthcare insurance. We work jobs that kill us so that we can pay for the health insurance that will be necessary to put our bodies back together after we've worked those jobs. So we pay into this system believing that these people have a prescription for us. They know what we should do with our lives, with our bodies. We at the root level. Okay, just listen to what I'm saying. And there's a lot of defenses that go up against this because people's whole lives have been organized around it. So all of this is very potentially threatening and triggering to people. The fact of the matter is we've handed over the power of our own consciousness about our health, which is this dynamic relationship with our bodies, the environment, the choices that we make, how we're living. It's so holistic. And yet, we have allowed the growth of this seed of dehumanization to grow to the point where doctors are spending more time now trying to find the code for what they're doing on a screen of tens of thousands of codes that accountants or budget office people in Washington, D.C. have sat there their whole lives trying to develop so that the government can get paid, rather than talking to patients. I haven't been in a doctor's office for many years for obvious reasons, but from the stories that I'm hearing from people, it's like doctors are not even making eye contact with patients anymore because, number one, too busy, have to get through 35 patients in an hour or whatever, and two, they have to document everything on a screen on the computer, or they don't get paid, or they have to run a practice where they make enough money to hire somebody to do that. And that's great for the high-end specialties that get paid and can find more ways to be paid, whatever. I'm not going to go into the details, but there's basically like more ways to get paid if you're doing procedures, which is why people who actually want to make money as a doctor, oh my God, what a crime, go into specialties rather than the front line of primary care. So this is a big, huge, giant problem that I'm not going to solve, and nobody's going to solve it today. But I am just wanting to use this as an example of how what I'm talking about when I'm talking about abuse, whether it's from a parent to a child, whether it's emotional, physical, sexual, or otherwise, whether it's neglect of a person's humanity by a teacher, anybody in a position of power in a child's life, all the way up to medical training. And I woke up last night to the reality that so much of my life has been spent buying into these power structures that go so far beyond the patriarchy. We're using this word patriarchy, ladies, we're using it. It's so like, okay, it's a convenient term, but do we know what it means? It's really not about men and women. It's about power and powerlessness, and also our own fear of taking full responsibility for our own choices and waking up to the denial that we've held around the issue of abuse to protect our abusers. So in my past posts, I've talked about this book, which was big in waking me up. And again, at certain points in people's lives, we're not going to be able to read these words and take them in. The gist of this is about how from infancy, the human brain is wired to attune to the parent in the environment. So Alice Miller was a psychotherapist who spent her life in rooms talking to people. She's not an academic reading books, trying to do studies. She's talking to people. So she's hearing stories. And it's about how we develop compliance to power neurologically as infants. And I'll just say that for me, one of the stories that my mom always tells about me is that I was such a good baby and I was always constipated as an infant. Interesting, because that is, when you talk about the gifted child, this is not about talent and playing violin. Constipation is like, oh, I'm not going to inconvenience you by having you change my diaper. Unconsciously keeping the parent happy by any means possible. So there's certain personality types, right, that do not want to rock the boat. I was one of them. So it's taken me until age 43 to wake up to the fact that classical music, the power structure of perfectionism and control, which a certain segment of the population defines as beauty, medical training, which I've just talked about, I don't need to say any more about, and then this idea of like selling advice to people, which I forgot about so I was in finance, and that doesn't even need to be said, right? We know what that is. And then my violin school, where I really made a commitment when I went into that, and I think I've talked about this before. I made a commitment not to perpetuate the public humiliation that was part of the violin school that I grew up in. I happened to thrive there because I was a very compliant and good student. So I rose to the top in that structure, and I just did it out of avoidance of that kind of humiliation. Yeah, I'm getting comments on Alice Miller. She wrote about 8 different books on this subject. I also love Free from Lies. There's also For Your Own Good. Yeah, that's the one. And she also wrote a book. She actually published a book of her paintings. So this ties back to Pamela Weibel. Sorry, I'm kind of going in different directions here, but I'm responding to the comments. Hi, Robert. So Alice Miller was a psychotherapist she uncovered this for herself, but also uncovered it through talking to patients. She published a book of her paintings where she rediscovered her childlike innocence by painting. And this is exactly what happened for me, starting in 2014, where I started doing art of all different kinds and really discovered the freedom of the blank page, and how I could do whatever I wanted on the blank page because no one was telling me what was right or wrong. And if I didn't like it, which I actually liked everything that I did, I still do. I love everything that I put on a blank page because it's mine. It's not about like whether it measures up to someone else's standard of what art is. I just like seeing that I exist on a page, and I did that. And somehow I kind of warped that into selling art, which is a totally other thing. And I've come back to like, oh wow, I really do art to like see me, not to make someone else like it enough to pay for it. But she published this book and talked about how just this free painting process freed her. But it's like this, it's like her least known book. And it's akin to like I don't know how many of you know about the number of intuitive painting kind of programs there are on the internet now, which is huge. I mean, there's just thousands of people selling like how-to classes on how to do art journaling and do mixed media painting and free yourself through art. And it's a beautiful community, and I have learned a lot from it. But I'm wondering if, I'm not wondering if, as I find my place in that ecosystem, like what is the thing that I want to put into the world, that's only half the equation. Freeing yourself and finding your child and finding that beauty is half the equation. The other half is coming to terms with the truth, coming out of denial. Why? Not to blame the people. So this is really important. It was a huge block for me. Like, why do I need to blame parents, teachers, authority figures, etc.? Can't I just skip over that and do the nice stuff? It's not about blaming them as people. It's about sorting out what was actually loving and nurturing and what was actually abusive to me as an emotional and neurological being. What was received as painful to me as a person, that was never allowed to be discussed. You're not allowed to cry. Okay, so like, what do we reward among girls and boys in our society? You don't cry. You buck up and you take it. You suck it up. You are poker faced. We admire those people. We admire high pain thresholds. We admire endurance of various hardships. Now, this is not about persistence toward a goal. This is about acknowledging your real feelings that I'm talking about. So there's a lot of people whose first response is like, oh, if we start acknowledging everyone's feelings, we're going to end up with a bunch of wusses. Nobody's going to get anything done. Nobody's going to want to do anything. We're just going to default to like sloth-like behavior. So that's kind of the fear response that people have. And I understand that that's part of the process, that we have to sort of like go through that period. And I again, I'm sharing this because I've only woken up to this cycle of response in myself so recently. And I just gave the example of last night, how after 4 years of not being able to read this woman's work, Pamela Weibel, that I'm referring to, I come back to it now with new eyes, and I'm able to see it. So this is part of my like shedding of the need for people to constantly like and approve of what I'm doing. And Facebook is, of course, this like terrible platform for reinforcing the brain's need to be liked because of the symbol of like. But again, I do this practice to have the truth come through my vocal cords and to heal my body as I speak my truth. Yes, that is behind my head every time I'm speaking, because I am experiencing through my own empirical experience, which no one tells us to do. Have you ever had a doctor that you paid to give you advice, tell you to go try something yourself and see how it works? Maybe you have. But in general, the messages that we're receiving from like the pharmaceutical industry and like what the role of doctors should be is that you go to a doctor and you do what he says, because he or she knows. They went to medical school. They know. They're reading the literature. They should know what to do. Is anyone really asking you what's actually happening? Some people are trying to do that. Most likely they don't work in the insurance system, and they're not calling themselves Western medical doctors. So I think I'm done talking for today because I've touched on a lot of things. But thanks for everybody for joining and commenting. That was fun. And Happy New Year. It's always a new opportunity to find a new story for who you are and how you're going to choose to live. And I also honor wherever anyone is on their journey, because it's a journey. It really, there's a lot of evolution that you and I can go through. So let's leave it at that. Thanks a lot.